Hi there, and welcome to our special revision webinar looking at 4 key aspects of labour market failure. An important area, particularly on the micro syllabus, but of course the labour market is a bridging topic that oftentimes bridges micro and macro, so it should really help with your synoptic element. Those of you, for example, facing a big 25-mark question. I'm going to start with some good news in the labour market. The UK unemployment rate has fallen to 4.7% of the labour force in the spring of 2017. That's the lowest rate of unemployment in the UK for nearly 40 years now. And that's good news, the unemployment rate falling. Keep in mind, though, in the exam, oftentimes a national figure highlights differences at a disaggregated level. So don't forget to remember to disaggregate in the exam. Think about regional unemployment variations, unemployment rates by age, by gender, and crucially, it's not just the level of unemployment that matters, it's also how long people are out of work for, the duration of unemployment. The second bit of good news I wanted to share with you is that the economic inactivity rate in the UK is falling. All kinds of reasons why people are inactive in the labour market. Staying in full-time education, for example, looking after a chronically ill relative, chronic illness amongst the person themselves. Perhaps also people are discouraged from working for one reason or another. The inactivity rate has started to fall quite sharply. Admittedly, I've changed the axis here on the y-axis, but it's fallen from about 24% down to 21% in the last few years. So in other words, this is a sign perhaps that the labour market is changing and fewer people remain inactive. That's people of working age. Now, there are many potential causes of labour market failure. Here are 4 key ones. Clearly, immobility of factors of production is a driving force of labour market failure. And we make a distinction between occupational immobility and geographical immobility. Geographical can sometimes be quite local. People want a job, can find work, but there are barriers literally to getting a bus or a taxi or moving 5 or 10 miles to find work. Second cause of market failure is when the tax and the welfare system creates disincentives to find and take a paid job. We make a distinction, for example, between the unemployment trap, which is where there are weak incentives to actually take a job, and the poverty trap, where there are disincentives to earn extra income. The poverty trap affects people both out of work and also in work, especially people on low wages. A third major cause of failure is discrimination by employers. In part, this explains the gender pay gap and the relative paucity of women in senior executive roles. Crucially, discrimination is a barrier to better pay and jobs and career progression for many affected groups. We'll mention that and use an analysis diagram in a second. And a fourth big potential cause of labour market failure is monopsony power. This is where you have a dominant employer in a particular town or sector where, in the absence of competition between employers, perhaps wages can be driven down by a monopsonistic business. It's really important as we head towards the exams to think of good contextual examples, contextual evidence to put into what can often be quite theoretical answers. So hopefully in this presentation over the next 15 minutes or so, I'll be able to give you lots of good examples to put into your revision notes. Here's one, a report from the National Housing Federation came out at the end of March, saying that the average private rent, so the median private rent in England, is nearly £8,000 a year, whilst wages for lower skilled workers are less than £19,000 a year. So in other words, rent is now taking up nearly 40, perhaps even 50% of people's average wages. People can't afford to buy, we've known that for many years, but now many people can't afford to rent either. A barrier to labour mobility and clearly a potential cause of a poverty trap. Another big change in the labour market related to immobility is the attempt by the government to upgrade the quality of and the signalling of vocational qualifications. They're trying to achieve more of a parity between vocational, so-called technical education and academic qualifications with the new T-level training routes. So they're trying to bring together thousands of separate qualifications and merge them into a smaller number of recognised T-level training routes, from engineering to accountancy to high-level manufacturing. Crucial to be aware of this, because one of the big fundamental issues in the labour market is the skills gaps, persistent chronic skills gaps in key sectors. And in a world beyond Brexit, Britain's labour market will have to upskill to remain competitive. Another big barrier to labour mobility is oftentimes the quality of and the cost of childcare. So the government has increased the amount of 3 hours of care per week to 30. Potentially a significant labour market reform. But of course, the evaluation is whether there is sufficient capacity in the system, both from local authorities and also private sector providers, to be able to meet the expected increase in demand. But childcare is a major barrier to labour mobility. Let's move on to discrimination. Discrimination is pervasive in the labour market. Despite the legislation that's around, for example, the Equal Pay Act and other forms of legal redress, labour market discrimination occurs when an employer uses a metric or a characteristic other than the measured productivity of an employee to judge their relative attractiveness for a job. And there are lots of bases for which discrimination can take place: gender, ethnicity, racial background, your faith, your sexuality, your age, your height, and any kind of characteristic including social background. Discrimination is undoubtedly a cause of labour market failure, and although the world hopefully has become a more tolerant and open place over many years, it's still a factor. How does this relate to analysis? Well, I think you're probably going to be using a labour demand and labour supply curve diagram to show this. If LD1, for example, is the employer demand for the non-discriminated group, if the employer perceives that another group on some metric is less valuable, their labour demand will be lower, so wages and employment will be reduced as a consequence. The gender pay gap is an important issue in labour market economics. This is the data, the latest data I have from 2014. Notice here that median weekly earnings in full-time jobs peak for men in their 40s, whereas they peak for women in their 30s. And the gap, the gender pay gap, widens from the 30s through to the 50s. There's a clear gender pay gap. Many reasons for this. If you want to add to your notes, I suggest you press the pause button at some point in the next 30 seconds. But it's important to think, when you're talking about the gender pay gap, to think about the economics of the labour market. Pay differentials in part reflect breaks from the labour market, women taking leave from work to raise a family, and crucially the age when that happens typically tends to be when careers oftentimes take off and there's a big spurt in wages. In many emerging and lower income countries, access to education and access to training is disproportionately available to males rather than females. Particularly the social norms can affect the access of women to work. A crucial point, I think, is point 3, that in many advanced countries the pattern of employment is a factor explaining the gender pay gap. There are more women disproportionately represented in part-time work, and often they're clustered in relatively low paid occupations, the so-called 4 Cs: clerical, catering, caring and cleaning. And also many women choose to work in vocational occupations, primary school teachers, nursery education, etc., where wages tend to be relatively lower because of the vocational aspect of the work. We mentioned discrimination, and the 5th point is that in many countries, for good reasons, female participation rates have increased, the so-called feminisation of the labour market, and that might have increased the supply of labour relative to demand, which perhaps may have contributed to lower relative wages. Now, a little evaluation point here. I'm using the word might and may, could. I'm not using the word will or must. Just using those words invites a degree of uncertainty and calibration in your writing, which is important at A level. A third area of another aspect of labour market failure is monopsony. So monopsony is becoming, I think, more important as a topic. It's one of those dry areas of the syllabus that students often avoid. I would advise you not to do that. Here's a quick chain of reasoning. So monopsony occurs when there is a sole or a dominant employer in the labour market, and the employer therefore has some wage setting power because of their buying power in the market for labour. Now, in theory, this leads to lower wages than in a competitive market. If you had, for example, 3 employers in a local town competing with each other for the workers, they might actually bid the wage up because they're competing to get the workers they need. If you have a monopsony, then the employer can effectively pay a lower wage because of the absence of competition. Good examples breaking into the news at the moment, businesses like Capita and Serco and G4S, the big outsourcing businesses, Amazon, Sports Direct with Mike Cashley, etc. Now here's the diagram. It's one of those tricky diagrams, and we've got a separate revision video on monopsony if you want to go through it in more depth. But basically the profit maximising employment level for a monopsonist is where the marginal labour cost equals the marginal revenue product, which is here. That gives you an employment level of E2, but you don't necessarily have to pay E2 wages. In fact, you have to pay W2. Instead of paying W2 wages, you pay W3 wages. So the revenue product is valued at W2, but the wage you pay is W3. I'm just going to shade in for you here. So here's your total wages, wage times employment, but here's the wages lost potentially from underpayment by the employer, some sort of exploitation there, that workers aren't getting paid their true marginal revenue product. So a monopsony can typically pay lower wages than in a competitive labour market. How can we address labour market failures? All kinds of different policies we can introduce. So in terms of labour immobility, we've already mentioned reform of vocational education, maybe employment subsidies to get the long-term unemployed back into work, encourage firms to offer more internships for students. And I think fundamentally, you've got to make the housing market work more effectively. You've got to address the chronic shortage of houses, affordable homes to buy and to rent. You've got to improve affordability. On the labour market side, in terms of disincentives and things, perhaps some economists favour lower income taxes at the marginal rate of less than 20%, for example, or they favour an increase in the tax-free allowance. Some economists favour benefit reforms, capping benefits, and also perhaps attaching more conditionality to welfare claims so that you have to actively searching for work or being on a training programme. Other economists favour a more interventionist approach and saying actually if you raise the minimum wage or expand the living wage, that increases the incentive to work and makes work pay. Typically, legislation is the tactic used to address discrimination. Much tougher laws on equality, penalties for businesses that found to have acted in a discriminatory way, stronger employment laws on unfair dismissal, for example. And in terms of monopsony, well, it's big employers are big employers. So the key is to provide some competition in the labour market. There is some evidence that actually the rise of the startups and the rise of self and part-time employment might, at the margins, give workers alternatives to working for monopsonistic employers. But I think the crucial thing is to encourage employers to pay proper wages. So I'm going to finish with what I would call some A-star context. Issues that A-star students are aware of and familiar with and can write about with confidence. First one is the idea of efficiency of wages. So this is the idea that the pay you offer to your workforce will have an impact on their productivity. Partly this is psychological. If you pay people better, they feel better about themselves and about their job. They take fewer days off work, for example. They tend to work a little harder because if they lose a well-paid job, they may not get a better one elsewhere. But crucially, if you pay higher wages, then employers are also encouraged to improve the human capital of their workforce, improve training to lift productivity. Aldi is a really good example. A lot of people think Aldi pays low wages. Actually, the latest evidence suggests that Aldi is one of the best paying supermarkets in the UK. It's a deep discount on price for the consumers, but it pays its workers well above the minimum wage. It's a German company which presumably understands the value of long-term relationships with its workforce. A second contemporary issue at the moment is the welfare cap. This was brought in to much popular acclaim by the Daily Mail and the Daily Express about 6 or 7 years ago. And the cap limits the amount of welfare benefits that a household working less than 16 hours per week can claim. That cap was £26,000 a year. It's now down to £20,000 outside of London, £23,000 in London. Now, I can see the arguments for a welfare cap. I mean, clearly capping welfare is an attempt to limit the total size of welfare benefits. One of the unintended consequences is that with renting becoming so expensive, if you cap housing benefit, for example, then a lot of people who are forced to rent are really struggling, fall into extreme poverty, and that is an issue that I think needs to be addressed. A third area, which is really interesting at the moment, is the rise of the so-called gig economy. Barely a day goes by when you don't see an Uber driver or Deliveroo motorcyclist going past you. People who are self-employed, they are not guaranteed the minimum wage. And here we have an article from Frank Field, erstwhile Labour MP, arguing that in fact the government should enforce the minimum wage for the so-called gig economy workers. There are quite a few legal challenges going through the courts at the moment from workers in the gig economy trying to get employment rights enshrined in common law through judicial announcements. This is a survey from the United States of contingent workers from 2016, looking at some of the benefits and the costs of being part of the gig economy. Benefits include the flexibility of hours, of course, the amount of control you have over when you work, ability to work from home. Equally, the downsides can include a lack of paid vacation, lack of sick leave, and vulnerable employment, job uncertainty about when the next job is coming for, or uncertainty about your income. UK, in terms of self-employment, has about 14% self-employed. That's relatively low compared to a number of other countries, including Greece and Turkey and Mexico, where self-employment is nearly or a third of employment in those countries. It's much lower in the United States. And the final issue that I think good A-star economists will have a view on and will be able to use analysis and evaluation is the economics of automation in the labour market. This is a survey conducted in 2016 by Citigroup and the World Bank, looking at the risk of the workforce being affected by things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, etc. And in fact, the evidence is, the contextual evidence is that there are more workers at risk in emerging, developing frontier economies such as Ethiopia and China and Thailand than in developed countries. In part because, of course, a lot of this robotic work can take the place of light manufacturing assembly. In the UK, around a third of workers are at risk of being replaced by robots, according to this survey. And the issue really is what happens to labour demand and what happens to the employment situation with robots. And in theory, of course, capital replacing labour does reduce labour demand. And you can build a coherent chain of reasoning to explain that. But the strong students kind of challenge and question. And I think this is an area where you can challenge and question to a very high level. Yes, robots can replace workers, but who designs, who builds, who maintains, who trains workers to use these kind of technologies? Amazon's a really good example of this evaluation point. That Amazon last year spent, I think, near enough $9 billion on research and development, and they now have over 45,000 robots whirring away at their big logistics centres. And there's some evidence there. The Kiva travels at 5.5 kilometres an hour and can lift up to 340 kg. Well, they obviously haven't seen me in the gym. But crucially, though Amazon's built significant scaled robotic capacity, their workforce at the end of September 2016 was twice that in 2014. So here's a business that's growing rapidly, that is employing robots, but also employing extra workers as well. Final debate is about how we pay people. So there is an ongoing issue at the moment about whether we should replace minimum wage, for example, or living wage, whether we should replace it with something a bit more radical, which would be a basic so-called universal income, a cash payment from government, perhaps paid each month, which is paid to everybody unconditionally, to all on an individual basis. This is out of a universal basic income. And hopefully you're aware of the Finnish experiment, which has just started, where a number of people are being given unemployment benefit, guaranteed £477 a month for the next 2 years. And they're looking to see whether taking money off the table stimulates people to find work or to become self-employed, start their own business, etc. We're looking to see. Well, that debate is going to run and run whether we should move towards a universal basic income. I quite like the article by Diane Call in the FT a few days ago, saying this is beautiful evaluation, saying that actually a basic income isn't necessarily the best idea. What people really need is a universal basic service, access to high quality public goods and merit goods, education, healthcare, childcare, whatever it is. Basic public services, according to her argument, are more important than a basic income. All very, very interesting stuff. Now, the labour market can become quite a dry topic for revision. Hopefully, this revision webinar, this presentation has alerted you to the fact that there's lots of really interesting economics happening in the labour market at the moment. It's a market that's changing rapidly, and one in which the examiners will continue to test your understanding, your knowledge, your analysis, and of course, your evaluation. Thanks for joining in. Take care and see you again sometime soon.